Burge's analysis, published Thursday, finds that on issues ranging from border security to immigration detention, white evangelicals, a group that includes dozens of individual denominations, from the Southern Baptist Convention to the Pentecostal movement, are substantially more conservative than the average American and even the next most conservative religious group. He calculated the share of white evangelicals who supported the policies, the share of the next most conservative religious group who supported the policies, and the share of all respondents who supported the policies. Evangelicals were consistently the most conservative by a wide margin. Only 4 of the 5 policies, on 4 of the 5 policies, evangelicals were at least 20% more conservative compared to the average American. The divide is smaller but still significant when compared to the next most conservative religious group. On 3 of the policies, there's a gap of 10%, but on the rest, it's 5% at least. It suggests that evangelical support for Trump continues to remain high largely because they like the policy outcomes of the Trump era, particularly on immigration. Burge's findings are in line with prior polling on evangelicals' positions on immigration issues. An October PRRI survey of more than 2,000 voters found that Republican white evangelical Protestants were 75% more likely than all Republicans to assert that immigrants are invading American society. A Washington Post ABC poll from January 2018 determined that 3/4 of white evangelicals nationwide favored the Trump administration's crackdown on undocumented immigrants compared to 46% of all Americans. And a Pew Research Center poll in May 2018 found that 68% of white evangelicals think America is not obligated to resettle refugees, 25% more than the national average. Evangelicals' attitudes towards immigrants don't seem to have much basis in religious scripture, as Tara Isabella Burton wrote for Vox. Quote, "The Bible contains numerous passages that seem to straightforwardly exhort care for the poor, immigrants, and refugees. Isaiah 10, for example, sees God excoriating those who turn aside the needy from justice and to rob the poor of my people of their right." In Matthew 25, which a Methodist pastor quoted to Jeff Sessions Monday while protesting his speech, Jesus warns his followers that those who withhold care for the poor or the refugee, the least of these, are seen as having done it to Jesus himself. Plenty of other verses, Leviticus 19:33-34, Jeremiah 7:5-7, Ezekiel 47:22, Zechariah 7:9-10, express similar sentiments. But since at least the 1970s, American evangelicals have generally been reluctant to count immigrants among those the Bible calls on them to aid. Trump has further fueled that reluctance, Burton adds. The age of Trump and the Christian nationalism he has frequently evoked as a rhetorical campaign strategy has seen white evangelical nativist rhetoric take on a more politicized role. As Messiah College professor and historian John Fee told Vox, white evangelical pastors, and thus their parishioners, are increasingly willing to take their sermon talking points and marching orders from an administration buoyed in part by its embrace of nativism. Some evangelicals have pushed back against the hardline turn immigration policy has taken under Trump. Most recently, Christianity Today, a prominent evangelical magazine, criticized Trump's cruelty and hostility towards immigrants and refugees, though as my colleague Jane Coaston notes, the magazine isn't representative of the types of evangelicals who back Trump. Evangelical leaders, including Reverend Franklin Graham, the son of the prominent evangelist Reverend Billy Graham, also widely denounced the Trump administration's policy of separating immigrant families in detention in the summer of 2018, though in that instance Graham also noted his continuing enthusiasm for Trump. But on the whole, the president's views on immigration have drawn support from evangelicals, a key voting bloc that helped carry him to victory in battleground states in 2016. It's a strategy that his campaign is hoping to replicate in 2020, and so far, it appears to be working. Trump has a 75% approval rating among white evangelicals compared to 42% among all Americans. So this is where religion comes into play. And as we see from that last post, it's not actually religion. It is people who are conflating their religious beliefs with their personal prejudices and somehow thinking that they all combine, even when they clearly don't. So it's important to make that caveat, because religion is one of those territories where people tend to kind of close up and form ranks, so to speak, whenever they feel that they're being attacked in some way, or they feel their religion is being attacked. And so I think it is important to make that distinction so that the listener can be aware that religion isn't telling anybody to do this, but religious beliefs are not telling anybody to do these things, but religious beliefs are being twisted and manipulated by those who find it useful to make them think that this is part and parcel of their whole belief system, when in fact it is actually antithetical in many ways. This next article digs into that a little more deeply, so I wanted to read these two together, because it kind of gets more into the mechanics of the thinking here. This one is entitled, "Why the Christian Right Worships Donald Trump." And this is more from a personal perspective, so this person is speaking in first person perspective, personal perspective, which would be first person perspective. Anyway, so this is not me talking, this is this person. Okay. So on the morning of September 29th, 6 weeks before the 2016 election, Donald Trump was in a conference room at Trump Tower in New York talking to leaders of the religious right about sex reassignment surgery. In a way, he was bringing about his own transformation, having quashed the idea that his run for president was a lark or a publicity stunt, having come from behind to take the Republican nomination, and having fought his way up the polls to the extent that he was within striking distance of Hillary Clinton. Trump was now trying to seal the deal, and that involved something he would soon become more known for, a discussion of other people's genitalia. With the operation or without the operation? Trump asked the conservative Christian leaders gathered specifically to ascertain whether to grant him their support. In other words, would HB 2, North Carolina's so-called bathroom bill, apply to transgender people who had not undergone surgery to alter their sex? Without the operation, Christian radio talk show host Frank Turek confirmed, according to a tape of the meeting exclusively obtained by the Rolling Stone magazine. If you're a man but you feel like a woman that day, if you're Shania Twain, you can go into a woman's bathroom and no one can say a word about it, end quote. Trump seemed to ponder this deeply. For much of his political run, the thrice-married, swindling, profane, materialistic, self-styled playboy had appealed mainly to the more fringe elements of Christianity, a ragtag group of prosperity gospelers, like his spiritual advisor Paula White, a televangelist who promised her donors their own personal angel. Christian dominionists, who believed that America's laws should be founded explicitly on biblical ones, including stoning homosexuals, and charismatic or Pentecostal outliers like Frank Amidia, the Trump campaign's liaison for Christian policy, who once claimed to have raised an ant from the dead. Considering their extreme views, these folks had an alarming number of followers, but certainly nothing of voting bloc magnitude. I'm losing my place again. And without the evangelical voting bloc, no Republican candidate could hope to have a path to the presidency. Evangelicals, a term that today refers to people who believe that Jesus died for their sins, that the Bible is the Word of God, and that every believer has a born-again or salvation moment, and that the good news of Jesus should be widely disseminated, make up as much as a quarter of the country, or close to 80 million people. Around 60% vote, more than any other demographic, and among white evangelical voters, more than three-quarters tend to go to Republicans, thanks to wedge issues like abortion, same-sex marriage, and transgender rights. Here's where the gray areas are between belief systems and political leaning. Trump was exactly the type of character you would expect values voters to summarily reject. Even before the famed quote from the TV show, the optics weren't great. He never gained a majority of Christian votes in the primary. Even after he secured the nomination and named Mike Pence to be his VP, a survey of Protestant pastors conducted by Christian polling group Lifeway Research that summer found that only 39% of evangelical pastors planned to vote for him. The meeting on September 29, 2016, was one of the ways he tried to move the needle, to convince the religious right that their vision for America was one he shared. Robert Jeffress, the head of 14,000-member megachurch First Baptist Dallas, a contributor to Fox News and one of the earliest evangelical leaders to support Trump, presided over the meeting. I usually stand when he comes in the room as a way of showing respect. He doesn't ask that, but that's just something that I've normally done. Jeffress explained to the assembled, who included Wayne Grudem, a well-known theologian and co-founder of the Council on Biblical Manhood and Womanhood. Eric Metaxas, a best-selling Christian author and radio host. Ryan Anderson, a senior fellow at the Heritage Foundation. Jay Richards, a philosopher and senior fellow at the Discovery Institute, a conservative think tank that campaigns against teaching evolution in school, and Ivanka Trump, who popped in momentarily to say hello. "What a group of people," Trump explained when he entered. "This is serious power. Fantastic. I don't even know if I've ever seen this." Over the next hour, the message was that theirs was a power Trump would heed, and heed more than any other president. He would end the contraception mandate of Obamacare. "We're getting rid of Obamacare anyway," he said. He would select only anti-choice judges, and this president could choose. It could be 5. And he would do away with the Johnson Amendment, which prohibits tax-exempt entities from endorsing politicians. Wouldn't it be nice if you could actually go and say, "I want Donald Trump"? He would never support prayer in school. He would support prayer in school, of course. I saw the other day a coach was giving a prayer before a football game, and they want to fire the coach now. He would oppose any bill that pulled funding from Christian schools that were charged with discrimination. "I can only tell you that if I'm president, it will be vetoed, okay?" He would keep transgender people from using the wrong bathrooms and locker rooms. We'll get it straightened out. And he would protect Israel, following the biblical pronouncement that nations that do so would be blessed. Quote from Trump, "Obama's been the worst thing that's happened to Israel. I was with Bibi Netanyahu the other day, and he said he can't even believe it." In other words, when it came to religious liberty, as the attendees defined it, he would make sure that America was on the right side of God. The meeting was chummy, solicitous. None of the points mentioned were likely to be ones that Steve Bannon would have let escape Trump's attention, but the gathering allowed him to demonstrate not just his allegiance, but also his attention. "Romney made no outreach like you're doing," Jeffress pointed out. "Bush didn't do it. McCain didn't do it. You're the only candidate who's asked people to come and share." As the leaders went around the table, Trump got talking points, things to say on the trail that would, like a dog whistle, signal something meaningful to a massive group of voters. In turn, the leaders got the promise of a bully pulpit, someone willing to be their mouthpiece on the American political stage that the whole world was watching. "You go out on the campaign trail," said Turek, "and every news organization is going to cover what you say." More than anything, it allowed Trump to display how his brand of pugnacious individualism could be used in service to the cause. "Are you allowed to use the word Christmas? Is there a restriction on the word Christmas?" Trump asked at one point, playing to the House. "As long as you don't refer to the baby Jesus as he," an attendee joked, "his preferred gender pronoun that day, that's what you have to use." Throughout it all, Trump was not positioning himself as a true believer. "I went to Sunday school," he said with a shrug, "but rather as a strong man, the likes of which the religious right had never seen." "Liberals are being the bullies here," the Heritage Foundation's Anderson told him at one point. If there is a culture war in the United States, conservatives aren't the aggressors. Liberals are waging a culture war. They are trying to impose their liberal values. Trump assured the group that, in his presidency, liberal oppression would end. Many of these things, I would say 80% of them, will be done immediately, he promised. I can tell you, you have my support. In Jeffers' final argument, he reminded everyone in apocalyptic terms that what that support would mean. What I want to say in closing is this election is not a battle between Republicans and Democrats. It's a battle between good and evil, light and darkness, righteousness and unrighteousness. This is the last chance we have, I'm convinced, as a country, to turn this country around. So, I mean, sorry. This is the thinking. This is what people are thinking. And this is how they kind of combine religion and their already existing prejudices and beliefs and bigotries, and so on. Anyway, I will continue. The meeting and other events like it spread the word, sending talk radio hosts and pastors and educators out into the world to preach the gospel of Donald Trump. On Election Day, close to 81% of white evangelicals cast their ballots for him, turning out to vote in greater numbers than they had for Mitt Romney and George Bush. And their faithfulness paid off, from naming Neil Gorsuch and Brett Kavanaugh to the Supreme Court, to transgender military bans and Muslim bans, to defunding Planned Parenthood and creating a division of religious freedom. Trump has followed through on the promises he made to powerfully push back on liberal aggression. Today, 82% of white evangelicals would cast their ballots for Trump. Two-thirds believe he has not damaged the decency of the presidency. 55% agree with Sarah Huckabee Sanders that God wanted him to be president, and 99% oppose the impeachment. Politics is a transactional game, and presidents don't need to be moral to be effective. While much has been made of the hypocrisy of Trump's Christian supporters, these value voters who'd once gone apoplectic over Bill Clinton's indiscretions and now capitulated to the most immoral president in living memory, the meeting at Trump Tower shows the logical framing of the argument that would lead a certain type of Christian to vote for Trump. I don't think Trump changed after that meeting, Jeffers told the reporter, but I know that some of those in the room did. Never have evangelicals had the access to the president that they have had under President Trump. What transactions don't account for, however, is how white evangelicals seem alarmingly keen to not just vote for Trump, but to also claim him as one of their own, to pronounce, as did Focus on the Family founder James Dobson, that Trump is a baby Christian, deserving of ample benefit of the doubt as he learns the ways of righteousness, or suggest that it may be immoral not to support him, as did Liberty University President Jerry Falwell Jr., or insinuate that Stormy Daniels' payment was fake news, as did Billy Graham's son Franklin Graham, or to go on national television and protest that removing Trump from office would lead to a civil war-like fracture from which this country will never heal, as did Jeffers. The fervent embrace of Trump seemed not just expedient, but something more insidious. If Donald Trump was to be its standard bearer, was something in American Christianity profoundly broken? The answer to that question mattered profoundly to me, the author, not me. This is the author speaking. I was raised a child of the Christian right. I know what they believe because the tenets of their faith are mine too. Growing up, I attended church at least twice a week and went to Bible camp every summer, singing songs about Christian martyrs who stood up to tyrants in the name of God. My brother and sister and I learned catechism and sang in the choir, but we also attended public school and played Little League and did community theater. We read C.S. Lewis, but also Beverly Cleary. We listened to Amy Grant and Simon and Garfunkel. We were taught that evolution was a lie, with NPR playing in the background. We knew that women should submit to their husbands, but also that sex within the confines of marriage could be mind-blowingly good, and that we should never be ashamed of our bodies. We felt that homosexuality was a sin, but we loved my mom's Uncle Robert and his handsome boyfriend Ken. We knew that the Republican Party was the party of family values, but we weren't particularly political. In Birmingham, Alabama in the 1980s, Christianity was the culture, but for my family it was much more. We believed in the Bible stories my mother read us over our eggs every morning. They girded our lives. More than anything, they taught us that we were beautifully and wonderfully made in the image of God, and because of that we should respect ourselves and everyone else we encountered. They made us believe that our humanity held a divine spark. It's a concept that has long animated Christians and explains why church history is littered with movements and leaders who have tried to hold America accountable to its theoretical ideals. Before the Civil War, Christian abolitionists fought not just for the end of slavery, but also for prison reform and humane treatment of the mentally disabled. While Wheaton College, the so-called Harvard of Christian schools, served as a stop on the Underground Railroad. But by the turn of the 20th century, mainstream Protestantism was engaged in a movement called the social gospel, which applied Christian ethics to social ills like child labor, poverty, war, and crime. Its adherents advocated in favor of women's rights and against racial injustice and income inequality. They believed that the kingdom of God could, through social justice initiatives, be realized in the here and now. There were prominent Protestants at the turn of the century who also trusted in science and, as scientific knowledge grew, accepted that the world was not created in 6 days, but rather over millennia, and that humankind was the product of evolution. These were not necessarily hills on which Christianity needed to die. After all, evolution does not rule out the possibility of divine purpose, but the subsequent theological liberalism that grew out of these findings created a backlash that gave rise to fundamentalism, the belief that the Bible was fundamentally, historically, and scientifically true. Fundamentalists were legalists, says Greg Thornberry, a theologian and Christian biographer, and fundamentalism was characterized by isolation. We're starting our own schools. We have our own churches. We have a bus running to programs. The isolation created a stark religious and cultural divide in America. By the time of the Scopes monkey trial of 1925, in which a Tennessee high school teacher was tried for teaching the theory of evolution in class, Christian lawyer William Jennings Bryan won in actual court, but lost in the court of American opinion. Fundamentalism's anti-scientific commitment to alternative facts cast the movement as backwards, delusional, and worthy of scorn. For the first time in American history, Protestantism's cultural dominance was called into question. It was a fall from a great height. Out of the seeds of the ensuing resentment and cultural irrelevance, and as a means of overcoming them, American evangelicalism was born. In the late 1940s, preachers like Billy Graham had begun referring to evangelical as a movement that was theologically conservative but had a heart for the world. Evangelicals engaged in American culture as a way of showing they cared. By the 1950s, Graham was preaching against communism and hobnobbing with presidents, though he once horrified Harry S. Truman by praying on the ground outside the Oval Office. They were wearing ice-cream-colored suits and hand-painted ties. Country come to town, says Thornberry. But Graham became more sophisticated after that. He was interested in the political shape of things. As it turned out, Graham's brand of engaged evangelicalism hit a sweet spot. In 1920, 43% of Americans were members of a church. By 1960, that figure had jumped to 63%. In 1976, the year that evangelical Sunday school teacher Jimmy Carter was elected president, fundamentalist pastor Jerry Falwell decided it was time to stoop to worldly matters and go on a series of I Love America rallies across the country to decry the decline of American morality. What constituted that decline, in Falwell's mind, was the 1971 case Green versus Connolly, which had determined that racially discriminatory private schools are not entitled to the federal tax exemption. Let me repeat that. What constituted that decline, the decline of American morality, in Falwell's mind was the 1971 case Green versus Connolly, which had determined that racially discriminatory private schools are not entitled to federal tax exemption. Falwell had founded just such an institution, Lynchburg Christian School, and believed in his God-given American right to exclude African Americans. He teamed up with Paul Weyrich, a religious political activist and co-founder of the conservative think tank the Heritage Foundation, who had long been searching for an issue around which to forge a Christian voting bloc. Together they reframed the debate, creating a playbook for a defense of white supremacy. Weyrich's genius lay in recognizing that he was unlikely to organize a mass movement around the defense of racial segregation, argues Randall Balmer, an Episcopal priest and historian of American religion at Dartmouth College. That would be a tough sell. With a sleight of hand, he recast the issue as a defense of religious liberty. Okay, so we're starting to see some shape here. In 1979, Falwell and Weyrich also founded the Moral Majority, using Falwell's mailing list to create what would become one of the largest conservative lobbies in the country, one dedicated to seeing Christian ethics enshrined in American law. The Democrats at that point were embracing feminism and gay rights and things like that, says Peter Montgomery, a senior fellow at People for the American Way. So conservative operatives looked at evangelical churches that had traditional ideas about the role of women and sexuality and saw those churches as places where they could convince people that voting conservative was part of their religious duty. What convinced Christians of that most compellingly, folding evangelicals into Weyrich's voting bloc once and for all, was a 1979 movie series called Whatever Happened to the Human Race, made by Pastor Francis Schaeffer and future Surgeon General C. Everett Koop. The films and accompanying book argued that abortion was infanticide. The films changed everything, says Thornberry. They made people think that the government was coming after them. They began to see the political left as being the church of secular humanists. So if we're going to protect our Christian heritage in America, then we're going to have to play ball with the Republicans. Despite having signed into law the most permissive abortion bill in the U.S. when he was governor of California, Ronald Reagan was only too happy to play ball as well, taking to the campaign trail in 1980 with an explicit endorsement of religious freedom. In so doing, Reagan cemented the idea that the Republican Party was the everlasting party of God. I'm not sure exactly when my family got the idea that they were at war with larger American culture, but I know that at some point our lessons about God's love became peppered with the idea that we were engaged in spiritual warfare, inhabiting a world where dark forces were constantly attempting to sever us from the will of God. The devil was real, and he was at work through gay Teletubbies and pagan Smurfs, through Dungeons and Dragons, through the horrors of MTV. At one point, my parents forbade TV altogether and disconnected the stereo system in my car. We still loved Uncle Robert, but believed that the AIDS he'd contracted was a plague sent by God, just as we believed that abortion was our national sin, for which the country would be likewise held accountable. We awaited the rapture, when Christians would be spirited away and Jesus would return to deal violently with the mess humans had made of things. Over time, and even before the introduction of Fox News, whatever nuance we might have seen in the culture evaporated into a stark polarity. Zooming out, cleaving was by design. It created a powerful us versus them mentality that mobilized the church base fiscally and politically. We were Christian soldiers.